Okay, Boker Tov. We started last class yesterday talking about inyanim related to the Hazara, to the repetition of the Amidah. We introduced why we have Hazara, why it's important, maybe some situations when we don't do Hazara and when Kol Ram might be appropriate. But on the whole, and we'll continue to strengthen this idea, Hazara is a takanat hachamim, an established part of the tefillah, and important to ensure that it is preserved in every single prayer. We left off with a question, talking a little bit about at what point should the Hazan begin the repetition of the Amidah? Does he have to wait for certain people to conclude their tefillat lahash before he begins the Hazara? And how many people should you have, etc.? So I want to start by reading the words of the Rama, Rabbi Moshe Isserlis, who has his notes on the Shulchan Aruch. He writes the following in Halacha Gimal of Seif Gimal of Siman Kof Kaf Daled, where all of the laws of Hazara are found. He says, Im yesh yehidim bakahal, if there are some individuals in the congregation, ma'arichim betfilatam, who are lengthy in their prayers, en l'shaliach tzibur lehamtin alehem. It is not incumbent or even appropriate for the Hazan to delay the start of the repetition on their behalf. Even if they are amongst the nobility or important people of the city. So too, if there is a minyan in the synagogue, one should not wait for an important person, a rabbi or anybody else who has not yet arrived before beginning the minyan. So if you have a minyan and the minyan is supposed to start on time, right? Daddy's gonna kill me. They start on time. It has to. It has to start on time. If you're waiting because you are saying, "Oh, someone's called me. He's on the way. Let's wait 2 more minutes before they get there," it's not appropriate. That's Torah Sibur, and that's putting the needs of the individual over the needs of the many. Sometimes you'll find this happen. People are very sensitive to people who need to say Kaddish for loved ones. And the person's on their way, they're just parking, they're just around the corner, and they're up to the Kaddish. To make the entire Kahal wait for the person to come in and to be able to say Kaddish, as important as it is against the halakha. So you're actually doing a disservice by waiting for the Kaddish, because in the process of waiting for the person to say the Kaddish, you're angering the rest of the minyan. And that is not an ilui nishmat for the person whom it's being said for. And so therefore, it's not appropriate to have Torah Sibur. They'll get another Kaddish. They'll be able to say at another time, or it's incumbent upon them to take extra precaution to make sure that they're on time. So neither for the rabbi, neither for someone saying Kaddish, nobody else should the minyan wait. And the same goes for the start of the repetition of the Hazara. Now, it is important, however, when you're deciding the repetition of the Hazara, when to start, that you do give a decent amount of time that is reasonable for people to pray the tefillat lahash, meaning that we don't want people to feel as though they have to speed through their silent prayer in order to be able to begin the Hazara. So if you have a Hazan that sometimes prays very quickly, but the rest of the Kahal, he looks around, 90% of the Kahal are still in their tefillah, I think in that situation, the words of the Rama are not to be applied. In other words, at that point, it's appropriate for the Hazan to wait a minute or two to give people a decent, reasonable amount of time to be able to say the Hazara, to be able to say the Tefillat Lahash, to do the Hazara. Otherwise, people are going to start speeding up their prayers, and that doesn't make for an appropriate Tefillah. So some people have a time frame. I've always found that about somewhere between 4 minutes, maybe a little bit more than 4 minutes, 4.5 minutes is a pretty reasonable amount of time for tefillat lahash. And at that point, if a person has enough people that have completed it, he should go ahead and begin. But if a Hazan prays very quickly, 2 minutes he's done, everyone else is still praying, it's not appropriate. They should give a reasonable amount of time to finish. The idea is that we shouldn't make everybody wait for just a couple of people who are still praying the tefillah. And that includes, by the way, the rabbi as well. And so Halakha Berurah discusses that some people, some minyanim develop the custom to wait for the rabbi out of respect for the rabbi. However, this can sometimes be problematic for the rest of the people. Not to mention for the rabbi, knowing that everybody's waiting for him, it can often distract him as well. And so therefore, it's appropriate to have a sort of an agreement, a hiskem, between the rabbi and the people, that the Hazan is not going to wait for the rabbi to complete his tefillah, or that the rabbi will signal even in the middle of his tefillah for the Hazan to begin when they feel that it's appropriate. But yes, he writes that it's acceptable for a person, even though generally we don't, hand motion or anything like that in the middle of our Amidah. In this case, he says it's appropriate for if the if the rabbi feels that it's distracting from his concentration, knowing that like you could sort of feel the energy in the air, that everybody's like waiting, when's the rabbi going to finish? When's the rabbi going to finish? Right? And believe me, we feel when that's happening, right? You feel the eyeballs. Yes, 100%.
Everyone is talking already.
Correct. So there's a Gemara. So there's a Gemara in Masechet Berachot that actually says that Rabbi Akiva, the Gemara says when Rabbi Akiva used to pray by himself, he used to start, when he prayed alone, solo, he used to start in one corner of the room and he would end in another corner of the room. What does that mean, the rabbis say? He was so entrenched in his tefillah, and in those days, they didn't bow the way we bow today. They bowed mamash all the way on the floor. They prostrated themselves on the floor. That Rabbi Akiva was so entrenched in his tefillah, and he was prostrating himself consistently throughout the prayer, that when you prostrate yourself, you move slightly each time you do it. He ended up in one side of the room, and he started Amidah on one side, and he ended up on the other side. And obviously, he was very lengthy in his prayer because he was intensely concentrating with Hashem. However, it says when he used to pray with the minyan, chick-chack, he used to pray much quicker in order to not burden the people. So it's also incumbent upon certain individuals whom they know others wish to respect, to wait for them, that they should pray in a little bit of a faster pace in order to match the pace of the minyan, so that it's appropriate, that there shouldn't be a Torah Sibur situation. So that's in terms of waiting and making sure that we start the Hazara in a timely fashion. Now, Danny brought up the question, how many people do you need, if any, to be completing with to have completed their silent Amidah before you begin? So one could make the argument, if you look at Seif Dalet over here, that Shulchan Aruch writes you need to have Tish'a Mechavenim, you have to have 9 people who are focusing and listening intently to the Hazara. You could make the argument that you need to have 9 people who have at least completed their Amidah and have the ability to listen and respond to the Amidah, to the Hazara, in order to be able to begin the Hazara. And you will find many minyanim who are stringent on this matter, who will look around and start counting the people and make sure that they have the proper amount of people who have been completed. However, if you take a look at Shulchan Aruch in a different spot, in Siman Nun He 55, Se'if Vav, where he talks about Hitztarfut Minyan, bringing people in to be considered with the minyan, he writes, let's say you have a minyan of 10 people, and one guy began his tefillat lahash, his silent prayer. He's unable to respond to Kiddusha, Kaddish, or the berachot of the Hazara. Or let's say you have 10 people, one guy's sleeping in the corner, right? And he's one of the 10. Can you say words of Kiddusha when he's sleeping? He says, even so, he is included amongst them to create a presence of 10 people where the Shekhinah is there to be able to perform Devarim Shebikdusha. So certainly based on this, it would seem to indicate from Shulchan Aruch that even if a person is in his Amidah, in which case he cannot respond, his very presence in the minyan and the fact that he's praying alongside them is sufficient to be able to consider 10 in order to say the Hazara, and therefore the Hazara can begin even if you don't have 9 people who have fully completed their Amidah. It would be considered a mechaven. That person would still be considered paying attention and part of the minyan, even though he's still in the middle of his Amidah.
So why do we say when there's 10 people, if that's the case?
Why? Because we still would have other people who potentially are talking, people who have completed the Amidah who are talking. Sometimes people exit the room. Sometimes people don't answer Amen and don't pay attention. And so for that reason, when you have a minyan mitzumtzam where there's a fear that people are not going to be mechaven, yeah, so then you have it, right? Now, so, again, we spoke about this yesterday. Is the number 10? Is the number 11? Is the number 12? To be honest with you, there isn't a specific number. It's any number in which a person may be fearful that you don't have 10 people properly paying attention to the Hazara. So in some cases, it could be 50. I don't know. Let's hope not, right?
Why is it such a machloket? I mean, I know people that walk into a minyan of 10 and he's caught up and the guy's flipping out.
Right. Because he wants to say Hazara. But he believes that he can.
We know that.
So I think part of it comes from, look, people have a lot of religious fervor. For some reason or another, I'm not sure why it is, but Hazara became like the barometer for whether or not you're a pious individual, right? A pious minyan, right? Oh, we do Hazara, we don't do Hazara, right?
We had 10 guys.
Yeah. Right.
He left the minyan.
So that's not okay, right? So that's not okay.
We had 10 people in the minyan.
Yeah. The guy.
So why didn't he just?
We started saying, the guy flipping out after the Amidah. Whoa.
Look, actually, I haven't.
That's a little, to me, that's a little extreme, you know. Right now they can't say the Kaddish, now they can't do, right. So I think that's a little extreme. Look, there's a lot of emotion that gets tied into this issue. Because I mean, I understand a little bit why, because it's one of those things of, do you respect the takanat hachamim, do you not? So certain people say if others are lax when it comes to Hazara, it shows a lack of respect for the rabbis and the hachamim, which I don't think that's always the case. People can say, normally we say Hazara, we have a great respect, but we're nervous about we're practical and nervous about the beracha levatala. As Danny pointed out, sometimes you have very religious people who are the opposite. They get upset at you when you don't do kol ram for Hazara because they're nervous about beracha levatala. So essentially you have two conflicting issues, right? Butting heads. You have the beracha levatala looming large, you have the takanat hachamim looming large, and people are jostling for position between these two things. And that's why, to me, it's always important to have a leader of the minyan who understands the people, who people defer to and trust their experience. And that's incumbent upon the people. If that's not your minyan, then trust the person who's leading the minyan to say he knows what's best for those people. Not everybody's bad and not everybody's trying to this. And that's why you have to have proper respect for that. To leave the minyan in the middle and avoid them being able to say Kaddish and other things like that, I think that's a bit extreme. I'm not sure that I would, sanction such a, not sanction is not the right word. Agree with such conduct. If you're not happy with the facts, then just stand there and let them do what they want. At least the people get the Kaddish, they get what it is. To walk out is a little extreme in my opinion. But
the thing that we know is incredibly important is the Kohanim. You didn't mention.
So what do we do with Kohanim? Kohanim is typically performed as part of the repetition of the Amidah. However, it's not limited to that. There is a scenario, it is discussed in Halakha, where Kohanim can be performed as part of the Tefillat Lahash, right? Because before the rabbis instituted Tefillat Hazara, there was still Birkat Kohanim. So they used to obviously do it as part of the Tefillat Lahash. Basically what happened is either the Kohanim congregated up by the dais prior to the start of the Amidah, or it is even acceptable by halakha standards for a person to uproot his spot in the Amidah to go up to the dais. So I'll give you an example. Let's take a different example for a minute and then we'll return to our case. Let's say a person is a Kohen and he comes a bit late to the minyan. So a recommendation to get tefillah b'minyan, a recommendation that a person can follow when he's a bit late and he's trying to catch up to the prayer to get a tefillah b'sibur, to pray with the minyan, is to start his silent Amidah together with the Hazan's repetition of the Amidah. So again, a person came in a few minutes late, he's saying Shema, the minyan's already ahead of him. He times it so that when he gets to the Amidah, the Hazan is beginning his repetition and he's going to say word for word his silent Amidah together with the Hazan's repetition. And in that way, he's going to fulfill a modicum of tefillah b'tzibur, of a tefillah with the minyan. In such a situation, let's say a person's a Kohen and now they're going to do Birkat Kohanim. He is permitted, as part of his silent Amidah, that when the Hazan gets up to Birkat Kohanim, for him to walk up to the dais, put his talet over his head, perform Birkat Kohanim, and then come back and return to his Amidah, to Sim Shalom. That is permissible. He's a Kohen, he has a responsibility, he's praying along with it, he has the right to do that. In those situations, I always recommend, it's appropriate for that Kohen, if he sees that that's what he's going to do, go up to the front at the start of your Amidah and pray at the front, so you don't have to worry about moving up to the front, and then you could do Birkat Kohanim as part of the Lahash.
He's the only one.
In any case, even if he just wants to participate as part of Birkat Kohanim, doesn't have to only be the only one. Yeah, it's done. It's not, now you have to be mindful of that, how you're doing it, but that's done. Now, this can also be done by an entire minyan. If a minyan is praying tefillat lahash, and they're going to do it as a kol ram, they're not going to do a repetition, but they don't want to miss out on the Birkat Kohanim, so they can invite the Kohanim to the front of the room before the Amidah begins. The Hazan, when he starts to reach the point in which they're getting to Birkat Kohanim, will raise his voice slightly to indicate to the Kohanim that he's about to say the Beracha. The Kohanim put their talet over the head. The Hazan calls out Kohanim and they perform Birkat Kohanim in the Lahash. Everybody pauses their Amidah wherever they are, they listen, and then they continue the Tfilat Lahash, and that's it. No answering Baruch Hu, Baruch Shema, just Amen. Just Amen.
And the Kohen has to be in the same spot after, or he could be anywhere in his Amidah.
It's appropriate he should wait for the Kohanim to be at the spot of Kohanim. Right, so that's why the Hazan should pray slowly,
Right.
and the Hazan should, at periods within that, raise his voice slightly. Right. Now, you could understand why a lot of times you could see that there's a lot of moving parts over here. You have to have people who have done this before, who are knowledgeable about it, has to be coordinated. So if this is not something that people are used to, then a lot of times people will just skip it, especially if, let's say, they're doing Kol Ram for Musaf, and they already did Birkat Kohanim in Shaharit. People will just bypass it because we already did Birkat Kohanim. To do it a second time after they've already done it the first time, it's just an additional, they've already fulfilled the mitzvah. So a lot of times if the kahal is not aware of how to do this, they haven't been trained in it, and there's a lot of moving parts and people could do something wrong. If a person answers Baruch Hu, Baruch Shemo, it's an interruption in his Amidah. So if you're nervous about those things, which a lot of people are, they tend to not do it. And that's why I don't think you see this happen very often. But in some cases, let's say you have places that are very remote. Let's say you have locations like you're in Philadelphia, other places that only have 10 people. If you're the rabbi of a kahal that only has 10 people, you struggle to get a minyan every day. This could be an option that a person does mamash every single day. They're used to it, exactly. They're the regulars. That's the point. Yeah.
So Kohen is unaware of what's going on. He's praying his lachash prayer, and they're gonna start Kohanim. What does he do?
He would get up and go and do Birkat Kohanim, and then come back. Yeah, and then come back to his Amidah. That's what I would recommend. Yeah.
Well, also needs to all these rules and everything, and the Ashkenaz don't even do it.
True. With Birkat Kohanim. Yeah.
It's like, you know, like you can move during the Amidah.
Right. Yeah, the Ashkenazim have a different perspective when it came to Birkat Kohanim, which we illustrated in past classes. Two other points that I just want to briefly cover with regard to the Hazara. Why is it that we don't have Hazara in Arbit? We have Hazara in Shaharit, we have Hazara in Minha, but we don't have Hazara in Arbit. Why don't we have Hazara in Arbit? Right, because according to Halakha, Tefilat Arbit is really Reshut. If you go to Masechet Berachot, there's a debate, is Tefilat Arbit Reshut or Chova? Is it a mandatory prayer or an optional prayer? And what optional means is a debate amongst the Rishonim, what it means optional. But let's take it at face value that a person can literally elect whether or not he wants to pray Tefilat Arbit. Since tefillot are based on korbanot, they're based on the sacrifices, and there was no nighttime sacrifice in the temple. It was merely the remaining fats and limbs that were burned over the course of the night. The rabbis instituted prayer at night, tefillat arbit, Yaakov Avinu, but it was not a mandatory prayer. And the halacha that is recorded is that we accept it's tefillat arbit as reshut, that tefillat arbit is an optional prayer. Now, it's true that the rabbis say that over the course of many centuries, if not millennia, the Jewish people have accepted as a whole that tefillat arbit is mandatory. We've accepted it upon ourselves that we're going to pray tefillat arbit. So today, arbit carries the same obligation as shaharit and minha in terms of a person's responsibility to pray. However, because at its essence, tefillat arbit is optional, when the rabbis instituted hazara, the repetition, they did not institute it for tefillat arbit. They kept it only for shaharit and minha, since if a person wasn't proficient in praying, he just didn't pray arbit. There was no need to repeat it. He just didn't have an obligation to pray arbit in that situation. Make sense? Good. One last thing to just mention is, there's a tshuva here in Yehavedat by Hacham Ovadia Yosef alav shalom. It's in Helek Gimal, Siman Tet Vav, Tet Zayin, in which he addresses an apparent issue, something that was done with regard to Hazara, that there was a practice, a custom, particularly interestingly enough, amongst yeshivot, amongst Torah scholars in places where they studied, to always do Kol Ram for Minha. For Minha, that when they prayed Minha in the afternoon, they never did Hazara. They always just did Kol Ram. Many yeshivot still do this to this day. And the question is, where did that come from and what's the support for it? Seemingly, the logic behind it is they want to shorten the prayer so that they can get back to learning Torah. Since learning Torah does occupy a higher place than tefillah, they wished, I guess, to streamline the prayers in order that they can go back to learning and not take away time for their learning. Obviously, this is talking about people at a very high level, but that was the question that was posed. And it seems as though a practice developed that in yeshivot, Kol Ram was the method of choice regarding Minha. And the question was posed to Hacham Ovadia, does this have a basis for it? Is this an appropriate conduct, or should yeshivot be doing Hazara? In it, he describes the origins of Hazara, and he talks about what they used to do. And then he quotes the Bet Yosef. This is the Rabbi Yosef Karo, the same author of the Shulchan Aruch. And I want to read to you his words. He says, Katav od Maran ha-Bet Yosef. Our master, our teacher, the Bet Yosef wrote in Siman Resh Lamed Daled. That's the Simanim that discuss Minha. Minhag ha-Ashkenazim. It's the custom of the Ashkenazim that the Hazan does a repetition in Mincha, just like in the morning. Aval Hasfaradim, interestingly enough, it was the Sephardic Jews. It was their custom not to do a repetition in Mincha. The Ashkenazim would do it, the Sephardim would not do it. Ela, the Shaliach Tzibur would pray B'Koram, they would say Kiddusha, etc. Says Maran, Aval minhag ha'ashkenazim lahzor ha'tefillah b'mincha hu ha'nachon. The correct practice is what the Ashkenazim do, at least what was in his time, to do Hazara. That's Maran. He says the Sfaradim are acting improperly by not doing it. And he continues to bring other sources, many of whom are mystically and Kabbalistically inclined. He brings Hagaon Rabbeinu HaKadosh, Rabbi Immanuel Hai Reke, B'Sefer Aderet Eliyahu, Karat Hagar, he was rebuking ala dohim hazarat Amidah, for those who are dismissive of the repetition of the Amidah in Minha, saying, oh, it's late, it's this, we're getting to sunset, whatever they were doing. And he says, no, you have until the stars come out to be able to pray. And even if you're going to pray Hazara after sunset, it's still appropriate to go ahead and do Hazara even after sunset. Then he continues, he brings the Arizal in his Sha'ar HaKavanot, who was makpid, who was diligent to pray Minha with Hazara, even if it was close to sundown. And then he brings more from the Bet Yosef. He says, Geonet Tzfat, the Bet Yosef lived in Tzfat, up in north in Eretz Yisrael. Tiknu, they established that the Hazan repeats the Amidah. Gazru Nidui, and they decreed excommunication, Le'over al Takanatam, for anybody who violated their institution. So they instituted harsh penalties for places that did not follow the institution of Hazara. He brought the Arizal. He says, Ulfize, this is Chamuvadiana. He says, based on this Lamadnu, we learn, Shekishe'en tefilat Hazara, when people don't pray the Hazara, Lo higiu afilu lahatzia tefillah. They did not reach even half of the level that their tefillah could have reached. V'lachen, he says, therefore, yafeh asu yehidei segula. It's a good thing what many individuals have started to do. Lehahazir atara leyoshna, to bring the crown back to its inception. Lehitpalel mincha im hazarat hashaliach tzibur, to pray mincha together with hazara. And Chamuvadia elongates. He talks about the minyan mitzumtzam situation. By the end, he says it's appropriate that certainly bnei yeshiva should not be doing kol ram. They should be doing hazara, especially when you consider that they're the role models for the rest of the community. So if people are looking to them and saying, they don't do hazara, why should any of the laymen do hazara? So even and Chamuvadia, by the way, was somebody who was diligent about every minute of Torah. Even he said, and especially he said, to the concern of, we want to learn more as opposed to praying more, he said it's not an appropriate concern. Hazara needs to be put in, it has to be restored, it has to be done, even if it comes at the quote-unquote expense of a little bit of Torah learning, be that as it may, that's what's appropriate to do. And on that point, I just want to mention one last thing quickly. I want to say Kaddish. So we'll end here, and I'll mention it tomorrow. We'll just ask him to come in for just 1 minute. Yeah, he's going to come. I'll just mention also briefly, what should the kahal be doing during the Hazara? We said they should be quietly responding. Can a person learn Torah during the repetition of the Amidah, or read Tehillim during the repetition of the Amidah? So while there were many poskim who validated the practice of doing Torah and Tehillim during it, Chamuvadia was a big supporter of saying one should not learn Torah during the Amidah. Cham David brings it in as well. You do see it all the time, and that doesn't mean it's right all the time, right? He says it's not appropriate for people to be studying Torah during the repetition. The goal of the repetition, as Shulchan Aruch brought it, is to be listening and to be responding. And while a person can justify it, he says it's a very bad behavior. Why? Because a few things. When a person is learning Torah, other people say, okay, he's learning Torah, I'm going to talk to my friend, right? People who are not diligent about learning Torah, it brings down the respect and the honor of the Hazara, because even though that guy's learning Torah, everyone's going to say, okay, so whatever, he's learning Torah, the Hazara is not important, I'll do something else. If I'm not learning Torah, I'm going to do something else. So it's disrespectful to the Hazara, and it leads others to go ahead and talk. Not to mention that person should be listening, paying attention, and answering the Hazara. I prayed with Chacham Ovadia Yosef, alav shalom, many times. He never, ever once picked up the sefer during the Hazara. He stood at attention, he answered, and that's why you never saw anybody in his shul pick up. If the rabbi's not going to pick up, and he was makpid on every second that he had of learning Torah. So it's also, I think, a little bit of yuhara, it's a little bit of arrogance for a person to do so. We'll finish that up. Baruch Adonai le'olam, amen ve'amen.